Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give everyone a second to file into this room. Morning, everyone. We're just going to give everyone a chance to file in just before we start. All right, everyone. We'll make a start. Thank you for joining us for the first of 3 webinars as a part of this Charity Fraud Awareness Week. This is an 8-year-long campaign that we are undertaking, and this is one of 3 webinars, and there are also 3 events going on throughout the week, and I will talk about those briefly at the end. Today we are joined by Tracy, the Insider Threat Manager at CIFAS, and James, the Culture Builder from PRPSFL. Both who will take us through the title of today's webinar, which is Cultivating a Counter-Fraud Culture in Your Charity. Just a couple of housekeeping things before I pass on. Any questions today, please put them in the Q&A box and we will get to them at the end, hopefully. And this webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand afterwards. And with that, I think I'll pass straight over to James.
Thank you, Hope. Good morning, everybody. As Hope said, my name is James Bolly, and I am the Culture Builder. So for the last 5 years, I've been helping small organizations, medium-sized organizations, to build effective cultures inside their organizations. Cultivate cultures, actually, is a very nice way of putting it, because culture is not something you can sit in a boardroom and create. It's something that exists in an organization, in amongst its groups of people, and it lives every day in how they behave. So cultivating it and nudging it is probably the best you can do, actually. And I have to hold my hands up straight away, and this might be a strange thing for somebody to say at the beginning of Charity Fraud Awareness Week, the first webinar therein, but I don't know very much about fraud. What I'm an expert in is building culture and how you affect cultures. And that's what I'm going to talk about this morning for kind of 5-10 minutes before handing over to Tracy. How do you build culture, and how might that relate to managing fraud within your organizations? And I think to kind of frame the discussion, it's really useful just to think first about what culture is in an organization. Now, when I'm running face-to-face sessions, I always ask people in the audience, can they define culture? And I think the most useful answer I've ever had in one of those sessions is, culture is what we blame when we think we've done everything right and everything goes wrong anyway. Culture is something that is very difficult to define, something that's very difficult to manage, and people find it difficult to talk about it as a result. But the simple definition that I would use for you is, culture is how people behave within the organization every day. If you have a team of volunteers who are collecting money on behalf of your organization, the way they behave is your organizational culture. If you have people in the office laughing and joking, that's part of your company culture. And the truth is that organizations have multiple cultures within them. While an organization can help to nudge a culture in the right direction with company values and with role modeling from the top of the organization, as soon as two people in your organization get together and interact, they are creating their own culture based around those. So don't think of your charity as having one culture. Your charity has multiple cultures that hopefully can all align underneath a single umbrella. But how people throughout your organization behave every day is your culture. And within this context, if you are looking at a culture, cultivating a culture to manage fraud or to reduce the risk of fraud, what does that mean? That means throughout your organization, whether it be volunteers or paid employees, whether it be the leaders or it be junior people in the organization, people every day behave in ways that are aware of the risks of fraud, able to work to prevent fraud happening, and able to detect where it is happening and raise it up. And I would say simply, if you look at your organization and you can't see evidence of those behaviors happening, then you probably don't have an effective fraud management culture today. What you are looking for is evidence that people behave in a certain way. Behavior is absolutely key. Now, in your organization, you might have ongoing training around fraud. You might have one-off interventions around fraud. You might have communication around fraud, and you might have fraud policies. These are all evidence that you're making an effort to cultivate an anti-fraud culture, but they're not evidence that that culture exists. And so the question is, how do you get people to behave in the right way to prevent fraud? So each of you is probably familiar with the phrase, and a previous CEO of mine used this frequently, the phrase that culture eats strategy for breakfast. What does that mean? That means that despite the best intentions of an organization from the top or from the bottom, the way people behave typically trumps your intentions. So looking within your organization today, how do people behave? Changing that behavior is what's going to drive whether or not you have a fraud culture. And behavior, as I'm sure you're all aware, is very difficult to change because behavior is based on people's attitudes, which are based on their values and their beliefs about themselves and about the charity. And so if you want to effectively change behavior in the long term, you need to be dealing with people on a kind of deep psychological level, affecting their beliefs about the organization and themselves and about the values. And that's why most organizations struggle with culture change initiatives, because it's very easy to do things on the surface and try and adapt how people behave from day to day. But actually, if what they observe reinforces their beliefs, and if their beliefs are in place, it's very difficult to affect that. And I think that's one of the key points from my session today before I hand over to Tracy. The way you behave, the way people in your organization behave in doing anything, helps to reinforce the beliefs that your volunteers and your employees already have about your charity. And you sometimes need to do something quite radical to alter those beliefs and make sure that they can behave differently. What we want people to believe about the organization is that fraud is important. Fraud is important to them individually, and they have a role in preventing it. It's their responsibility to think about fraud, and it's part of their role as a volunteer or as an employee to help prevent it and call it out when it happens. And unfortunately, if you have a culture in your organization where people are afraid to speak up, afraid to challenge, or afraid to blow the whistle about anything that's going wrong, you're going to struggle to encourage them to do so about fraud as well. So I'm going to talk a little now about how to build culture generally, and this is based on my experience over the last kind of 5 years helping organizations adapt people's beliefs and change culture effectively. Now, Tracy's going to talk a little bit about communication, and communication is obviously important. As a general rule, what I've discovered with my clients is that however much communication you think is enough about a subject, you probably need to double it and then do a little bit extra as well. Because although you're bored of delivering a message, people don't hear the message the same way every time, and maybe they don't hear it 5 out of 6 times that you communicate it anyway. So whatever communication you are doing today about fraud, think about how you can do twice as much and a little bit extra as well. And communication is an indication that you care, but you can't change people's behaviors just through communication. And the reason I'm called the culture builder is because I believe that building an effective organizational culture is a bit like building a house. When you're building a house, you don't just wander into a vacant plot of land, start building some walls, chuck a roof on and build a fish pond and then say it's done. You have to do things in the right order or everything falls apart. And unfortunately, building culture is very much the same. You need really strong foundations built, and that is your purpose and your values. Why do you exist as a charity? And your values? What are the guidelines you want to give people every day about how they behave? Now, as I say, I'm not an expert in fraud. I have done some work with charities, and I have an associate who's done a lot of work with charities, and she always uses the phrase, most charities in her experience are less like organizations and more like chaotic clubs, and more like groups of people who've got together to coalesce around a certain goal, but they all believe that the best way to achieve that goal is slightly different. It's really important in a charity organization that you take time to define values, to give people guidelines on how they should behave every day, and then give people the space to think about how their behaviors contribute to those values and ultimately help deliver the purpose of the charity. Because people bring their own experiences to our organizations, and their understanding of what the charity is for and the best way to help it might be different from what you want them to believe, and particularly with volunteers who in organizations get involved with for a range of reasons, and might have a range of assumptions and beliefs that you need to explore with them. So it's really important, I think, as an organization, that you're very clear on what your purpose is and what values you want people to uphold day to day. But that's just the foundations. You can't hope that the house is going to be strong and successful just by building great foundations. You also need to build a great superstructure, walls and such like, and that is your strategy. How are you going to deliver on your purpose in a way that helps move the organization forward? Once you've built the walls of your organization, the walls of your culture in this metaphor, you need to put a roof on. And the roof is what keeps everybody safe and dry and keeps everybody inside the organization. And that is how you measure your success and how you incentivize people. I work with lots of organizations that talk a great game about how they want their people to behave, and then all they measure is how much they've sold, or in this instance, how much they've raised in donations. If that's the only thing you're measuring, then you're probably not going to drive the right culture, because it's completely misaligned with what's important to you. Once you've built the roof, you need to look at how you treat the people in your organization. Do you have a defined volunteer onboarding experience? Do you have a defined employee experience? What's the entire journey of volunteering or working with your charity? And how do you reinforce the values that you want people to live every day through that? And then next, how do you treat your customers, your donors, your key supporters, the public, the people that you're serving? All of these things need to be aligned with what you say you stand for. Otherwise, it gives people license to believe what they want about your charity. If you want people to believe that your organization exists for a certain reason, you need to give them evidence. It needs to be evidenced in the strategy, in what you're measuring, how you treat your people, and then how you treat your customers. And then when people are talking about fraud, they mainly start with policies and procedures. Okay, we're going to have a fraud policy, we're going to have a whistleblowing policy, we're going to have a cyber fraud awareness policy, etc. It's all great, but those policies are built on top of the 4 areas that I've already spoken about. They don't exist in a vacuum. And when people say culture eats strategy for breakfast, that's exactly the phenomenon that they are describing. When organizations launch new policies, new initiatives, new procedures, and people just ignore them, that is culture eating strategy for breakfast. And the reason is because there's misalignment between values and policies. If you are trying to get people excited about fraud, interested in fraud, and doing their best to prevent fraud, if you are treating them in an offhanded way when you onboard them, if you're measuring them on the wrong things, they're going to generate all kinds of beliefs about what the organization actually stands for, how trustworthy it is, and how honest it is. So it's absolutely vital that you build this alignment through what your organization is doing, what it's measuring, how it treats its people, and how it treats its customers, the external environment, before layering those policies on the top. Now, you might launch a policy, it might chime with those things accidentally, or people might buy into it and you might get successful. But you need to think about whether those policies and procedures are properly aligned with what you stand for, and how you're reinforcing those beliefs in amongst your people, be they volunteers or employees. And then lastly, we talked about communication. You can communicate until you're blue in the face. If that communication goes against what people believe about your organization, they're not going to get involved in it. And so the last stage in the house building metaphor, you've built your foundations of strong values. You've got your walls, which is your strategy. You've got your roof, which is how you incentivize people and what you measure. Then you have your how you bring power to the organization and how you take away waste. That's how you treat your employees and your volunteers. You've got your windows and doors, how you interact with the outside world. That's how you treat your external environment and your customers. And then your processes and policies are the decorations within the house. You can't put up the wallpaper until you've got everything else in place. You can't have effective processes and policies until you've got the walls up and the rooms built and everything. The last thing, the communication, is the landscaping. It's how you do the garden. It's the last thing you do. And it attracts people to the organization, and it attracts money to the organization. It attracts interest, but it only attracts interest if it's aligned then with what's inside, because you can have a beautiful garden. As soon as somebody opens the front door and comes into a dilapidated house, they see through it, and the garden is a joke. So that's my general process for building culture. Each of those sections is probably a 2-hour webinar on its own. So I realize I'm going over in some not very much depth, but I hope that gives you an idea of how I would recommend you build culture in your organization in general. And I've got a couple of questions to ask you, to leave you with, and a couple of tips in relation to a couple of those areas that I hope mean you can start measuring this and cultivating it today. Because it's all very well saying, here's generally how you build a culture. Okay, what does that mean for me? And what does that mean for my organization? So a question I often ask businesses that I work with is, when was the last time you targeted a customer group, or better still, chose not to work with a customer group or not to sell a certain product because of the fact it didn't align with your values? So think about this in kind of a charity context. When was the last time you turned down a donation or an opportunity to partner with an organization because you felt like it might not match your values? And when was the last time you made that decision on the basis that it would open you up to too much fraud risk? Nothing speaks more powerfully to your values as an organization as to where you're prepared to get your money from and how you're prepared to make that money. Now, in a business context, I've worked with a recruiter recently who stopped doing temporary recruitment because it really went against their values of, we genuinely want to care for people, but they were putting people in temporary jobs in warehouses they knew were in terrible conditions and would last a day, and they weren't doing the best for their customers as a result. What's the equivalent in your organization, in your charity? What do you have to hold your nose to make the charity function to do? Because examining that is a strong message about what's important. In terms of metrics, when was the last time that in a team meeting you talked about the fraud risk or how much fraud was committed in your organization? Is that a topic that ever comes up in team meetings? Is that something you would ever put in your annual report? When was the last time that one of your full-time employees got a bonus payment based on the fact that they minimized a fraud risk, or indeed got celebrated for doing so? And in terms of your employee experience, when was the last time that you praised someone in an appraisal because of how they managed the risk of fraud in your organization? When was the last time that somebody was promoted based on the fact that they blew the whistle effectively? When was the last time that a volunteer position advert or a job advert mentioned fraud, or was it discussed in an interview? Doing these things communicates from the very beginning that fraud is important to your organization and sets the tone. And I could go on about this all day. Essentially, the key thing I want you to take away is that people won't believe that fraud matters in the organization until the evidence is undeniable to them. And you need to start building that evidence from the second they start interacting with you, in interview, in onboarding. It needs to be integrated in how you interact with them. And lastly, we've all heard the fantastic, terrifying stories of what happens when this goes wrong and millions of pounds are embezzled from a charity. What about the opposite? What about all the fantastic stories, the great work people have done to prevent fraud, to blow whistles? When was the last time they were celebrated? And what can you do in your charity to promote those stories? You can start building a mythology around those and reinforcing values, like fraud being important, straight away by building the right stories and mythologizing them. So I hope that gives you a good sense of an overview of how to build culture. In my experience and my associates' experience of working with charities, culture can be really difficult because people come to the charity with different expectations, different beliefs, and different drivers. By being really clear about what values exist in your organization and how people behave when your organization is at its best, and building strategy, measures, and employee experience, customer, external world experience, policies and procedures that align with those, and reinforcing those every day through strong communication, we've seen some really effective culture change. And I believe that you can build a really strong fraud management culture. You can cultivate that within your organization by figuring out what the link is between fraud management and your values and your success as a charity, and then building it into those levels. If there's one thing you do differently today, go away and look at how you measure fraud risk and how much fraud activity is happening in your charity, and communicate it to your team in every meeting. But in the long term, make sure you're building an effective culture, because how you do anything is how you do everything. And make sure that people are setting the right tone from the top and living your values, and then the fraud culture should hopefully come along alongside it. Now, there's going to be a Q&A at the end, so if anybody has any questions, please do put them in the Q&A box. I've spoken quite generally about cultivating culture in organizations with a little bit of an interest in fraud, but I'm going to hand over to Tracy Carpenter now, who I know is going to speak kind of much more knowledgeably about fraud and charities. And I hope it follows on nicely from what I've said. Thank you for listening to me, and I'm really excited to introduce Tracy.
Thanks very much, James. And that was so interesting what you were saying. So thank you for setting that scene here. Hi, everybody. I'm Tracy Carpenter, Insider Threat Manager at CIFAS. And I'm now going to talk to you around the insider threat and how you can help your organisations, your charities, with employees and volunteers. So hopefully you can all see my screen and my slides. So first of all, obviously, when it comes to charities, you will apply for grants. There'll be different funding available, but a lot of you will be relying on the kind-hearted public. We've gone through a global pandemic. We've gone through a cost of living crisis. We're now seeing inflation on the rise, and that can really make it tough for individuals to be able to make those donations to charities. So it can feel that actually when they are deciding which charity to provide their hard-earned money to make that donation, it can be a difficult decision. It can be something that they'll really think through if they want to support a particular charity. So actually making sure that you are a charity of choice, that you've not got issues where there's bad publicity because you've got dishonest employees and so on. Just before we started the webinar this morning, I was reading a report which actually said that in a recent survey of those who responded, 50% of frauds were actually conducted by people from within the organisation. So that's half of the frauds of those who had responded to that survey were actually, it was a volunteer or an employee who had facilitated that fraud. And quite rightly, what James was saying was that actually, when was the last time that we heard of this charity has done this great piece of work, they've raised all of this money, they've made this change. We don't hear that as much as we do when it comes to actually the stories of individuals, volunteers, employees who have actually been dishonest in their capacity as somebody representing the charity. It's really easy to be able to identify if there are instances whereby the individuals are committing fraud. You can go online, you can type in dishonest employee in the charity sector, fraud in the charity sector, and there's all of these different things that come up, all of these different stories. Some really interesting ones. This first one, a charity employee was jailed after stealing £200,000 to fund a gambling addiction. The annual turnover of this charity was £926,760 a year at the time that this fraud was carried out. That is a huge chunk of the revenue that that charity received that was then taken by an employee to fund a gambling addiction. The case in the Echo, this was an individual who was employed as a charity shop manager. They actually had a record of stealing from charities previously. There wasn't robust pre-employment screening checks that were undertaken, and that then led them to being able to carry out a further 2 lots of fraud when they were in this next charity as well. And I'll come on to the pre-employment screening process and the importance of that. Next one, charity employee was jailed after spending funds on holidays and concert tickets. They stole £145,000 to pay for those holidays and concert tickets. So that was purely just to fund a lifestyle that they wanted. 2 further cases then, a greedy con woman who fled to Turkey after admitting £150,000 charity fraud. That actually was the end of the charity after that £150,000 had been taken. And then the case with BBC News where the boss was jailed for taking £1.3 million from a homeless charity, and that actually then saw that charity go into liquidation. So as we were saying, these are just some of the cases whereby it's really easy to be able to identify these. But if we're looking for stories of how great a charity has done and the good that they've done, they are a lot harder to come by, not because they don't happen, but because the press and the public love to see the stories of reputational damage where controls have gone wrong and things haven't turned out the way that they should. So when it comes to employees and volunteers committing fraudulent conduct, there's 3 main ways in which they'll do that. It's opportunity, motivation, and rationalisation. If they can hit one of those areas, that will be enough for them to then consider committing fraudulent conduct against your charity. So looking at opportunity, first of all, poor pre-employment screening, we saw that case that was in the Echo where a worker had already been stealing and committing fraud against their previous employer, and then what they did is they went into another charity and they were then able to do that and steal from a further 2 charity shops. When it comes to pre-employment screening, it can seem really difficult when you're in a charity, especially if you've got volunteers that you're wanting to recruit, and they can feel very much, well, I'm giving my time and why do I have to jump through all of these hoops to go through the pre-employment screening process? They protect you as a charity. I cannot emphasize enough how much you need to do those pre-employment screening checks, making sure you know exactly who you have in your charity, either as an employee, as a trustee, as a volunteer, in whatever capacity they may be in, making sure you know exactly that background of that individual. Lack of controls. Lack of controls can really allow that opportunity for individuals to be able to commit fraudulent conduct against the organisation. And it can be anything from actually there just not being the correct processes in place. It could be that actually there's a whole load of data of people who have been making donations to the organisation that are saved and they're just not securely. They're not secure. Anybody can go take a handful of that information. It can be sold on the dark web for a volunteer or an employee to then get money in exchange for confidential information of individuals. There can be so many ways that that lack of control can help aid fraud. What I would say is within your organisations, take a step back and look, is there any controls where actually there are gaps and you actually believe, do you know what, when I look at it now, that could actually facilitate fraud to happen within the organisation. And you certainly won't want to be one of those headlines which organisations are saying, this is some of the fraud which has happened within the charity sector. Lack of segregation of duties. It can be really difficult for organisations to have enough volunteers, to have enough employees to say, actually, we need to have multiple different people that are doing parts of these processes. And where they're volunteers and they're unpaid, it can be even harder because you're actually saying to those volunteers, we want to be able to do these checks. We need to actually have that segregation of duties from a fraud perspective. And it can very much feel, well, hang on, are you suggesting that there may be some dishonesty here if one person's doing it? So it's actually also about approaching that in the way that it's seen as this is for the good of the charity. Conflict of interest can be an area that's not necessarily always thought about. If, for example, you're a charity and you are then awarding grants to different organisations, to different individuals, to different projects, and so on, actually, is there any conflict of interest between somebody who's either a volunteer at your charity, working for your charity, and somebody that they may know, that they may have a relationship with one of those organisations, making sure that any relationships are actually said about early on, making sure that they're not involved in any bidding processes, any warding panels, and so on can be key. A lack of audit trails, making sure that there's auditable trails to be able to identify who has carried out activity, what has been carried out, when has it been carried out, so that employees don't see, do you know what, we've got all of this opportunity, because we know that anything that we do isn't actually audited. And it is a really sad fact that where there is opportunity, somebody will take that opportunity. We will probably on this call be thinking, do people really steal from charities? Is this something that they will feel that is okay to do? And is it any different from somebody who's working for a large corporate organisation who may be committing fraudulent conduct from the charity? As we saw in one of those examples from the press, when it comes to somebody stealing with a gambling addiction and somebody's funding that addiction, whether it be gambling, drugs, shopping, alcohol, cosmetic surgery, whatever that addiction may be, individuals, they've said in the past when I've spoken to them, they didn't care where that money came from. They just knew that they needed it to get that Netflix of whatever their addiction is. So if there is that opportunity, somebody will find it, and it's your job to make sure that opportunity isn't there. Motivation, any of us can be at any point have that motivation to commit fraudulent conduct for whatever reason. We'll all be able to say, if we couldn't provide food, if we couldn't pay bills, and so on. So that motivation can be different for each individual person, depending on what their circumstances are. Paying rent and mortgage, keeping a roof over your head, your family's head, that can really push that motivation to be able to say, well, actually, I need to do this because I need to keep this roof over my family's head. Putting food on the table and having that idea that actually I need to be able to make sure that my children are fed, that my family is fed, and it just being this one-off thing of, do you know what, it's ages till payday, the price of food has gone up, I just need some help this month. That can provide that motivation for volunteers, for employees to be dishonest. Paying utility bills. We're going into a second cold winter where utility bills have risen. Last year there was support from employers, there was support from the government. There may not be that same support available this year, and individuals may be thinking, how on earth am I going to pay these bills? That can provide that motivation for somebody to be dishonest, for them to take that opportunity that they've identified from the previous slide and then utilise that to their benefit. Unexpected bills can provide a motivation for employees to be dishonest. It could be that somebody would never have any intention of committing fraudulent conduct, of being dishonest at all. Their car breaks down on the way to work, their washing machine breaks down when they get home, they've got Christmas coming up, all of these bills, they don't know how to survive because they don't have the money to pay for all of these bills. That can provide that motivation and push them to commit fraudulent conduct. Debts. Could be their own debts. They could also be providing support for friends or family members who may have debts. They may have lost their jobs, could be surviving on just one income, and that actually can then make your volunteers or your employees feel, you know, I just don't have enough money to go round to last the month. And then we've also covered addictions and that motivation of knowing that nothing else matters. That next fix for the addiction is what matters. And then looking at rationalisation, this fits into what James was talking about earlier, all around that culture of an organisation. And it's often said that employees are able to rationalise their behaviour of committing fraudulent conduct. We all will rationalise our behaviour every day. We may well start the week and say, do you know what, I'm on a diet this week, I'm not going to have any chocolate, or I'm not going to have a drink this week. And then it's the end of Monday, it's been a really hard Monday, and it's like, do you know what? I do need some chocolate because it's been a really hard week, or it's been a really hard start to the week. Actually, my friends just called me, seeing if I want to meet them for a drink. I'm going to go out for that glass of wine because I want to catch up with my friend. That's how easy it is for us to rationalise our behaviour on an everyday level. We will all have rationalised things that we've done this morning. We'll have maybe rationalised an extra 10 minutes in bed of, well, if I don't wash my hair this morning, I can have an extra 10 minutes in bed. It's no different when somebody is committing fraudulent conduct against the organisation. One of the main ways that individuals can rationalise that behaviour is if they are feeling undervalued, if they feel that the culture is toxic, and that can really affect the organisation. We'll have all seen people who we've worked with in the past, I'm not saying at your charities, but anywhere in the past where they feel really undervalued, and it goes to this attitude of, do you know what? I don't care about this company anymore. This will certainly be more for your paid employees rather than volunteers. I don't care about them. I'm not sure that they care about me. They didn't help me. They weren't flexible when I wanted to change my hours. I haven't had a pay rise this year, yet we know that the director has had a pay rise. All of these ways can help an individual to rationalise activity that they're carrying out. And that can be the same when we look at everybody else is doing it. We have this culture where everybody else does it, so it's okay because other people are doing it. If somebody, for example, sees that somebody is falsifying their expenses, they're falsifying a timesheet, it's okay because everybody else is doing it. So we don't really need to worry about that. We also see that need the money and being able to rationalise it. Well, I've got all of these unpaid bills, it's Christmas coming up around the corner, and I really need that money to be able to pay for these bills, to pay for this medication, to pay for Christmas. And I'm not sure that we always do the right thing within the charity. We give these grants to organisations that actually may not need that money. So I know that I need it, and so therefore I'm going to take my share of that money. And that's how easy it can be for an employee to decide that they can rationalise their need for the money over what the charity is doing with that money. It isn't monetary. It may well be that you think, well, when it comes to fraud, it can and staff theft, it's generally a hand in the till. And if it's not monetary, it can be seen like it's not actually fraud. It's not hurting anybody. If somebody's adding that extra time onto their timesheet, if somebody's actually selling the personal information of those who are making regular donations to your charity or those who are providing grants and they're receiving a fee for that, well, it's not actually money that I'm stealing. I'm just providing that information to somebody else and then they're providing me with money on the back of that. That I'll pay it back at payday can be really easy to say, it's just short term, just need it to cover that bill, I just need it to cover Christmas, and I'm going to pay it back on payday. So actually, I'm not hurting anybody, it's just a short term loan. Almost every act of dishonesty can be rationalised by the perpetrator. Spoken around how easy it is to be able to rationalise our activity. We do it without thinking. And that is the same for employees, that they rationalise the way that they're committing that fraudulent conduct. I know we're really short on time, so that's all that I've got time to cover today, but James and myself are happy to take any questions. And our contact details are here if you want to contact myself, and I'm sure James may also want to provide his email address if there's any follow-up questions as well.
Thank you so much, both of you. It's so interesting when it comes to insider fraud and creating safe spaces for your staff and volunteers. I think we're a little short on time, but we might have time for just one question. So someone has asked about how we can celebrate people who report without making it public. Have either of you got any suggestions on how that you could celebrate someone coming forward without maybe everyone knowing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are always challenges around people not wanting to have things shared. So I appreciate that question very much. In most circumstances, you can share the situation and the action without naming the person. And yeah, the more you can make of people doing the right actions, even if you don't identify the people, it can really help. But I know, Hope, you've got kind of a whistleblowing webinar later on, and there might be more advice there. I mean, Tracy, do you have any advice on that one?
Yeah, and the whistleblowing webinar sounds like a great place to go to hear more about whistleblowing. And it is making sure that you're protecting that individual who, if they want to come to somebody and they don't want to be anonymous, making sure that actually there's protection for that individual, or if it does go down the whistleblowing route, that there's support available. And also actually offering a small incentive for if you do know that there is fraud that is being carried out and it is found to be that once it's investigated, there will be a incentive that's paid, and it can be dependent upon what the charity sees is the correct incentive for the fraud that's been identified. But actually making sure that individuals know it's okay to talk. And I know, Hope, that we've got that sheet around volunteer fraud and talking. And we were having this conversation before we started this morning around telling employees and volunteers it's okay to talk. We're in this new age where people can talk.
Yeah, definitely. There is one more question, but I'm going to pass that on to both of you after this, and we'll see if we can come up with an answer. As we mentioned, this is the first day of Charity Fraud Awareness Week, and as Tracy and James have both alluded to, there's more coming up today and the rest of the week. Tracy mentioned that we have a help sheet that's just gone live about speaking to your volunteers about fraud and how to approach them on that subject without making them feel blamed or like you're targeting them. Later today, we have an update from City of London Police going live about 3. And Tracy also alluded to this report that's come out. BDO and Fraud Advisory Panel worked on a survey, and the report is going live at 12 o'clock today, so not very long. For the rest of the week, we have events still in Glasgow and Belfast that are available. There are 2 more webinars. Tomorrow's on managing your whistleblowers, and a help sheet will come out with that as well. And there's a couple more police updates and blogs from the charity sector who are explaining the problems they are seeing and ways they have put in place to combat that. Thank you for coming today. Thank you so much to Tracy and James. I know that everyone has enjoyed it so much. We'll be posting this onto our Prevent Charity Fraud website as of this afternoon, and it will be available for the foreseeable future. We don't really take things down from there. So have a lovely rest of the day, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Right, thank you, everybody.